We don't understand the relationship between the parts of the brain that are articulated and conscious and then the lower parts that are sort of the repositories of traumatic information. And there's deeper mysteries that we don't understand too. So it turns out, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term epigenesis, but there are studies of epigenetics now that show that there are certain experiences that alter your genetic structure. And well, we know that partly because if you put yourself in a new situation, a radically new situation, new genes will turn on inside of you, and they'll code for new proteins, and they'll build new structures for you. So new neurological structures sometimes, and that's part of how you can adapt. And it's also part of the reason why banging yourself against various obstacles, in a kind of systematic way, is a good way of expanding your range of capabilities. So we know that experience can turn new genetic processes on that are sort of latent prior to that. But what we didn't know was that some of those experiences transform your genetic structures in a way that you can transmit to your children. So, and that's Lamarckian evolution. No one ever hypothesized that was possible. But you can look it up. It's mainstream science now, although, people are still not really sure what to do about it, how to think about it from a conceptual perspective, because that sort of thing wasn't supposed to be possible. So, so we have no idea to what level of being your experiences can be encoded. And we really don't know how you encode experience anyways. We don't know what the fundamental structures of your memory are, how that's associated with your conceptions of time and space, and how that's related to your ongoing experience. Those things are deeply mysterious to us. And what happens, at least in part with hallucinogens, is that they seem to take all the horrors and terrors that you haven't dealt with and just put them in your face now. And that's part of the shamanic experience. And so it's not something for people to take lightly, and generally people don't. So, but I've often found that it was very strange that these chemicals produce experiences that are so strange that our culture instantly deemed them illegal. For me, it's like looking at what happened back in the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church went after Galileo because he had something, strange to say about the moon. It's like these experiences have tapped into something that's a very, very primordial element of human existence and associated, say, with these shamanic rituals that have been going on for tens of thousands of years and that human cultures have always used to orient themselves. And they're so there's so much anathema to our current culture that we punish people severely for experimenting with them. It's very, very peculiar behavior. So, although there's no doubt that this sort of thing is dangerous and very peculiar. But, So the shaman report relatively constant types of experiences when they're undergoing their transformative experiences. And here's a couple of them. One is climbing the world tree. We've already talked about the world tree. And what that seems to be, if you look at the reports of the shaman, is that their consciousness seems to be able to move itself up and down levels of analysis that aren't necessarily available to you in your normal state of consciousness. Now, whether or not that's a real phenomenon or whether or not it's part associated with the dream isn't exactly clear. So, part of it is, for example, that the shaman become convinced that they can communicate with things like plants at a very fundamental level. But they are also capable of, when they climb up the tree, for example, of entering sort of the realm of their ancestors and communing with them. And I just read a book here recently about the revival of Mongolian shamanism. And the Mongolian situation is kind of interesting because it was a pretty archaic culture. And then the Soviets came in there and communized it, which was sort of economically useful, but socially it was an absolute catastrophe because the Soviets were murderous beyond belief. And then in 1989 they just left. And so the Mongolians, they were completely up in the air then because their traditional culture had been fragmented and, the whole communist thing was a bust. And they reverted back to shamanic practices. And the shaman told them that part of the reason that they were all suffering was because they had lost contact with their ancestral spirits. And partly what they meant by that was that the continuity of the culture had been disrupted. And so people were identityless. And it was funny because when Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Soviet Union, and he wrote extensively about the Soviet experience, his eventual conclusion was that the best route for the Soviets to take after the collapse of communism would be a return to the sort of evolutionary process of development that characterized their exploration of Orthodox Christianity. Because you have to fall back to something, because people need a meaning structure. And you know, modern people have a hard time with incomprehensible religious meaning structures because, you know, we demand a certain amount of rational clarity. But there's a problem with that because the absolute mysteries of life cannot be formulated with rational clarity. You have to kind of encapsulate them in a mystery that's partially understandable because otherwise they stay completely out of your grasp, you know, and you have no answer to the question, you know, well, what's the ultimate purpose of life? You know, well, you're not going to be able to get that answer in a really tight box, you know, that you could open up and it's just going to provide all the answers. It's going to be murky, partly because it has to apply to everyone. But the fact that it's murky and symbolic in a sense and sort of multifaceted doesn't mean it's unnecessary or wrong. And, you know, the more I've studied the theories that underlie personality theory, the more I've become convinced, and for me, convinced beyond a doubt, that our connection to the archaic structures of the past that defined our cultures, like without that, you're without roots. You know, and that makes you weak. That's the big problem. It makes you weak. There's nothing to you. Every whim can possess you. Every stupid political idea that comes along is instantly your God. You know, and you're certainly capable of going crazy with masses of people in all sorts of insane ways. It has direct consequences. You have to be grounded in something.